Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Twombly, National Executive Director of Pi Sigma Alpha, and I'm thrilled that you could join us for this next segment of our Centennial series. Now, with 2 weeks until November 3rd and Election Day, it couldn't be a better time for us to get an insider's look at what political scientists are thinking about this election. We're really honored to have two outstanding scholars with us today to break down what they see are the key elements of this election and the days after. So let's get it going. First, let me bring in our host. I'm really excited to have as our guest host, Emory University senior Shreya Pabaraju. Shreya currently serves as the president of the Alpha Epsilon chapter at Emory University, where she's a double major in political science and English and creative writing. And as part of her undergraduate experience, she served as a research assistant on a project funded by the National Science Foundation. She's been a freelancer for the Emory student newspaper and has co-hosted a radio show called The Next Best Alternative, which investigates hyphenated identities, politics, and social justice within the music and poetry scenes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shreya. She's going to lead the way for us today, and I'm excited you could be here. Go ahead, Shreya.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to have everyone here today and to have early interest in. I wanted to start by introducing the two professors we have with us today. Professor Abramowitz is the Alvin W. Barkley Professor of Political Science at Emory University, where he has served on the faculty since 1987. Since 1988, his time for change model has correctly and precisely predicted the popular vote winner within 2 percentage points or less in the United States presidential election. The model predicts the two-party popular vote based on the state of the economy, the incumbent's popularity, and the time that the incumbent president has been in office. He's the author or co-author of 5 books, including Voice of the People, Elections and Voting Behavior in the United States. Dr. Gillespie is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University. Professor Gillespie's current research focuses on the political leadership of the post-civil rights generation, but more broadly explores political participation, inter-minority group competition, and evangelical politics in the United States. Through her work at the James Weldon Johnson Institute, she seeks to support scholarship that asks and answers relevant questions that cut to the quick of America's racial problems. Her most recent book is The New Black Politician, Cory Booker, New York, and Post-Racial America. So with that, I was hoping to kind of start by asking I think the first thing on everyone's mind is who do you think will win the election? I think especially based on Dr. Abramowitz's model, which has been correct by 2 percentage points in almost every election. I think it would be very interesting for everyone to hear what's on your mind.
Well, I'll start off, but first of all, I have to correct the very flattering introduction that was made there, but it's not quite accurate. So actually in 2016, the model predicted that Donald Trump would win the popular vote by a very narrow margin. In my defense, all I'll say is that I added a disclaimer at that time saying that I actually didn't believe that was going to happen. As it turned out, I was right that it didn't happen, but maybe I should have stuck with it because then I might have looked like I got it right, even though I didn't. So, we're in a very challenging time right now for forecasting elections. The 2020 presidential election presents unique challenges to forecasting, including, of course, the fact that it's taking place during this ongoing pandemic, which is going to affect and the way we're voting in many ways. Another challenge is, of course, that we're going through this severe economic downturn as a result of the pandemic. And the third challenge is, and there may be others too, but the one I'm thinking of is that we have an incumbent president who's really in many ways different from any incumbent we've ever had before. And I think all of this is making it difficult. Some of these things were present in 2016 as well, I think, and made it somewhat challenging. But I think in 2020, I think we need to be very cautious in terms of how confident we appear to be in making any sort of prediction about how this election is going to turn out.
So I usually rely on Dr. Abramowitz for the predictive models because I don't do forecasting. And I'm actually really intrigued by the model that he put out this year because he usually doesn't do electoral college forecasting, but he did it this year and, walks everybody through it. So I'm really, excited to see how this ends up playing out. One of the things that I do feel somewhat confident in is I feel pretty confident based on where we are with polling and where I expect it to go in the next couple of weeks that Joe Biden is going to win the popular vote. I think the big question, the $1 million question here is whether or not that actually translates into an electoral college victory. So that's what we're all waiting to see. And one of the mistakes that we made in 2016, and I will sort of point out, not just in the defense of Dr. Abramowitz's models, but in defense of pollsters in general, they actually weren't wrong in terms of sort of where the national polls came to. We think that that number, whatever number they say is the number, what they're giving you is the mid of a range of possibilities. And those numbers were in fact pretty accurate, but it didn't translate well into what was happening in Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania. One of the big problems in 2016 was that people stopped polling in those states. And so I think people thought that like preferences were going to kind of be sort of like set in stone and gel a couple of weeks before the election, when it turns out that there was still volatility and there was still time to shift. So I think we all have to be prepared for new information to come in, cause people to potentially change their minds and change the vote. And I say that even with many people already locking in their preferences to be an early voter.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Andrea was saying there. I think that at this point, given the polling lead that Joe Biden has in the national polls, that there's a very, very strong likelihood that he will win the popular vote. But again, the question that we're asking is, could we see something similar to what we saw in 2016, where Donald Trump was able to eke out this really narrow win in the Electoral College by winning very narrow victories in several of these key swing states. So that's why this year I've modified my model to, first of all, try to forecast the electoral vote. Second of all, to focus exclusively on elections where there is an incumbent running for re-election. Because what I've learned is that when an incumbent president is running for re-election, the election is overwhelmingly a referendum on the incumbent. And that's why one of the key differences between 2020 and 2016 is, in fact, that Donald Trump this time is running as an incumbent. And that's one of the reasons why I think we're not likely to see a repeat of the kind of result that we saw in 2016, which was due to the fact that we had quite a bit of instability in voter preferences and a large percentage of undecided and third-party voters who apparently shifted to Trump in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. With Trump now the incumbent, the election focusing more on him and his record, I don't think we're going to see that to the same degree. And I don't think we're going to see undecided and third-party voters shifting disproportionately to Trump. Because again, the election is now focused more on his record and not so much on his opponent in the election, who's Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, Joe Biden this time.
Thank you so much. Kind of going on this note of like, I guess we have to be like a little bit more cautious about whether or not we can get the electoral vote or the electoral college vote. Was this idea of voter suppression and what that might look like in the weeks, especially as like the in-person election is approaching, and as students especially are trying to vote early. Voter suppression has had a history of disproportionately targeting Black, Indigenous, and people of color through voter ID laws, socioeconomic barriers, and many others. I think now, especially in the time of COVID-19 and the pandemic, a lot of these barriers might be exacerbated. What do you think the role is of like, first, like the university in like preventing some of these barriers, but also the community at large, and what can we do to ensure that this right to vote is secured? And what does it mean for like future elections going forward?
So, I think it's really important to identify what voter suppression is. because I think we've heard this, and I think because of the heightened racial tensions in the United States, we could be quick and sometimes too hasty to identify everything as voter suppression when it's not. And so I'm not saying this to dismiss the idea of voter suppression or to say that it's not real, because it's very, very real. But I think it's important for us to understand how that manifests, and there are things that we can do to combat it. So I'm going to define voter suppression broadly as any type of systematic activity which seeks to depress or diminish the likelihood that certain groups are going to be able to vote. It can be done very intentionally, or it could actually be done unintentionally. But if we observe disparate impact on the back end, that certain people, certain groups of people are less likely to vote than others, then we have to acknowledge that suppression is taking place, whether or not we intended for it to happen or not. I think intention is important in terms of identifying sort of the motives behind proposing certain types of activities or laws or policies. If it's being done with a sense of gamesmanship, particularly partisan gamesmanship, given racial polarization and party identification, right? Oftentimes there's a racial subtext to that, and that should be combated. And that fits into a long history in the United States of coming up with facially neutral rules to try to prevent people from voting. So nobody, in, turn of the 20th century, sort of in the South, when they were rewriting state constitutions, ever put, we're going to deny Black people the right to vote in their constitutions. They just came up with dumb rules that would disproportionately affect African Americans, either in sort of how it was stated or in its application. So whether if that was, requiring poll taxes of everybody, but then grandfathering in or waiving the right to have to pay the poll tax to people whose grandfathers had the right to vote, which would basically require, all Blacks to pay the poll tax, and would absolve many whites from not having to pay poll taxes. Like, these things were intentionally done to prevent Blacks from voting without ever having put Black, Negro, or African American in a state constitution. If we look at other practices like the selective application of literacy tests, felon disenfranchisement, all of these things were done specifically to try to prevent certain people from voting. So I think that civil rights activists are completely justified when they speak out against certain types of activities, like, say, strict voter ID laws, right? Because it looks like the same stuff that people were doing 120 years ago. But I think it's also important to realize that there are activities that people are engaging in now that maybe didn't intend to try to sort of put a finger on the lever of sort of helping some groups or hurting other groups, but they in fact did. So in Georgia, where we all live and go to school, on this panel, there was a policy that said that if you filled out a voter registration application, then the name has to match what your records look like exactly on either driver's license or social security record. If there's one discrepancy, an errant accent mark, a hyphen that's missing, let's just say a clerk actually makes a typographical error in writing out your name, that could hold up your voter registration application and prevent you from being able to get on the rolls, right? And so what analysis has shown is that people of color are more likely to have their voter registration applications denied because of exact match. And some of that has to do with cultural reasons, that especially if people don't have Western names, people might actually end up typing them incorrectly, or even if it's something simple like you have a hyphenated last name and sometimes you use the hyphen and sometimes you don't, that could raise a flag that could prevent your voter registration application from being accepted. And this is something that civil rights groups have gone to court for. They got it enjoined, and then the state legislature sort of put it back on the books again, right? That's the kind of thing that we have to combat. And we also have to combat other things, like perhaps underestimating the number of people who are going to turn out in poor and minority precincts. And if we're underestimating that and then basing the number of poll workers or the number of machines that certain communities get, that might exacerbate the wait times in poorer communities as opposed to affluent communities, right? Those are all things that we can do to try to prevent folks from sort of being discouraged from voting. And that's apart from outright things like intimidation or misinformation, where you tell people election day is on Wednesday, or perhaps you stand outside of a polling location with a gun to try to scare people away from voting. That's different than necessarily assuming that if everybody shows up at the same time to early vote, during the early voting period, that's evidence of voter suppression. That could, there could be some fixing. But it very well could be 100 people showed up at the same time and everybody's just going to have to get in line and wait their turn. And so I think I want to be really careful to understand that, yes, we should be vigilant in looking at voter suppression, but we also have to be scientific about this and make sure that we don't automatically assume that everything is voter suppression without actually doing the proper analysis.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. We have to be careful about what we call voter suppression. And there are ways in which there are rules and procedures that may have unintentionally have the effect of that have a disproportionate effect on minority communities. There are other policies that are clearly intended to have an effect in suppressing the vote among minority communities. Let me give you an example of each. So as far as unintentional effects, I think one of the things that we've seen is the longer lines at the polls in minority precincts. And this is something Andra alluded to. Now, it's possible that some of that could be intentional, but I also think that a lot of it is unintentional and is a reflection of the fact that, at least, for example, in our primary election in June, that African-American voters were disproportionately likely to wait to vote on the day of the primary rather than voting early or voting by absentee ballot. And that resulted in much longer lines. And there were other problems that complicated that, including poll workers not showing up because of the pandemic, including a reduction in the number of precincts because of the pandemic, including social distancing rules that allowed fewer voters to actually be inside a polling place at any one time. So all these things sort of contribute to this impression that you saw in these very dramatic pictures of very, very long lines of people at the polls in minority communities, especially in minority communities. And I think largely unintentional, maybe not totally unintentional.
So, and the issue there is that if it's the same precinct at the Atlanta University Center near where Spelman and Morehouse are, right, then sooner or later an election official needs to take notice that, oh, we continually underestimate. So like if you are presented with that evidence and then you don't do anything about it, then I'm going to call it voter suppression, right?
Absolutely. And the Secretary of State and the county election officials claim that they have corrected a lot of those problems that occurred in the primary, and that we're not going to see that same sort of situation develop in the early voting for the general election and on election day. We'll see if that's the case. I want to mention one example, something that I think pretty clearly is very intentional voter suppression, and that's felon disenfranchisement laws. So we have felon disenfranchisement laws across the country that vary from state to state. Some states have much more severe restrictions on people than others, depending on where they are in the criminal justice system, as far as whether they've served their sentence, whether they're on probation, parole, completed all their requirements, etc. These felon disenfranchisement laws, however, are generally strictest in the southern states that have the largest African-American populations, and we know they have a very disproportionate impact on African-American men in particular. Now, in the state of Florida, the voters actually passed a constitutional amendment to restore voting rights to felons who had served their sentences, because under the existing Florida law, even after someone had served his or her sentence, that individual had to then apply for reinstatement. You were not automatically given, your right to vote was not automatically restored, as it is in most states. So that referendum passed with over 60%. It had to get at least 60% of the vote. It passed. It got over 60% of the vote in Florida. This would have restored the right to vote for tens of thousands of ex-felons in the state of Florida, disproportionately African-American, but all ex-felons. So what happened then was that the Florida legislature, seeing the results of this, decided that they were going to take it upon themselves to pass legislation that said that, well, wait, before you can get your voting rights restored, you have to first pay all fines and restitution that is due. And this can include court costs. It can include restitution to victims. There's a variety of things, and it can run into a significant amount of money. And that law clearly went against the intent of the voters, I think. and was challenged in court, but it was, I believe, upheld. The challenge was that this is kind of hidden poll tax. So now you have a situation where people have had their voting rights restored, but they really can't exercise them. There are groups down there that are trying to pay these fines on behalf of the individuals who wish to vote, so that they can exercise their right to vote. And Michael Bloomberg, for example, has kicked in some money toward that end. But I think this is clearly an example of where the Republican-controlled Florida legislature, realizing that the large majority of individuals whose voting rights would be restored, the ex-felons whose voting rights would be restored, were likely to vote for Democratic candidates, were determined that they were going to make it as difficult as possible for those individuals to exercise that right.
Thank you. Yeah, like on this note, I guess, of like voter suppression and all the different threats that could, I suppose, like exacerbate like tensions and ensuring like suppression happens. I suppose I was wondering, on our own campus, I've seen a lot of students kind of rally together and try to ensure that like the university is trying to give students election day off as a holiday, and there have been different movements by different student groups to make that happen. At the same time, there's also been this like statement by the university that said, well, they're committed to election day, like and ensuring that like students have access to different resources and opportunities to go vote. We still don't have it all. And so I suppose the larger question is, what do you think the role of students would be in ensuring and securing the right to vote for like other students? But more than that, what do you think the role of the university should be in guaranteeing that right to students?
So I think part of the issue is timing. And so oftentimes student groups will make these requests, you know, in August or September of an election year. And the challenge with that is that, particularly in presidential election years, I think there's a case to be made that perhaps you should have election day off every year, but they'll probably really only seriously consider doing that in even numbered years, is that the calendar is set like years in advance. And so it would actually be disruptive to instructional time and for learning, and especially for professors who had made their syllabi in August and sort of, you know, needed that day to teach, to be able to do that. So I would just say that even if you can't get it this year, this might be worth doing a little bit of extra planning and perhaps even understanding, especially for folks who are juniors and seniors, that you might not be in school by the time this policy actually goes into effect, to make sure that it actually happens at some point in the future. The other thing that could actually be beneficial, especially as we are changing polling locations, some people have alleged, we haven't proven it yet, but that moving polling locations is being done with the intention of trying to suppress votes because it confuses and discourages voters. But that if we are going to start moving polling places around, perhaps it makes sense to create precincts on college campuses to make it easy for students to be able to vote. And then, you know, some schools may decide that, well, if we have a polling place on campus, and particularly if it's a polling place on campus for early voting as well, that then mitigates the need to try to readjust the schedule. Because you're going to have to make up like that sort of lost contact time at some point. So whether it is starting a day early in August or whether it is keeping folks a day later in December, there would probably be some issues with that. And in particular this year, with respect to everybody trying to finish by Thanksgiving to get people home for the holidays to try to mitigate the spread of COVID, they were probably thinking about that first and foremost.
Yeah, I would say that what I've been seeing going on the Emory campus, and I suspect similar things are going on college campuses around the country, is that there's been a very concerted effort not only to encourage students to register and vote, but specifically to encourage them to register and vote early and to vote by absentee ballot if possible. So more and more states over the past few months have made it easier for people to obtain absentee ballots and vote by absentee ballot. The number of states that allow what's called no excuses absentee voting, where you don't have to have a specific reason why you're requesting an absentee ballot, or in some cases the coronavirus itself can be the reason that you want to vote by absentee ballot. So now it's relatively easy for students to obtain an absentee ballot. And we have had an organized effort on the Emory campus to assist students in providing them with online tools, for example, with which they can both register to vote, but then request an absentee ballot and explain how you go about that, vote requesting and then voting by absentee ballot. Because this avoids the problem of having to vote on election day. But we're also providing information to students about polling locations for early voting, as well as locations and instructions for voting on election day for those who are voting here in Georgia. Many of our students, however, are registered to vote outside of Georgia and other states. So I think we're seeing around the country efforts to encourage college students to register and encourage them to vote, but with a special focus this year, I think, on absentee and mail voting, because again, I think this is a way that we can avoid the problem of having to go to and then wait in long lines at the polls on election day.
Thank you very much. I guess shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that I feel like I started to notice a little bit is that vice presidential candidates play in this election somewhat of a different role compared to other elections. With President Trump contracting COVID and Vice President Biden's older age, I feel that like a lot of the attention has been directed towards Vice President Mike Pence, as well as Kamala Harris. And so I was wondering how you think that changes the dynamic of the election, A, but B, also, especially as Harris faces the double standards of being both a woman as well as a minority, as being both Black and South Asian. I was wondering how you think this might affect like either the way that people choose to vote in this election, or whether or not we see any more of those double standards taking place like at the debate.
Sure. So, I mean, I think there are a number of issues that are at play here. So historically, the choice of a vice presidential candidate ultimately doesn't matter. And when it does matter, it matters for a percentage point or two. And so the kinds of elections where it mattered, the most recent example would be Sarah Palin with John McCain, and for the same reasons that we think it might matter this year. So in particular, when you have older presidential candidates, right, there are legitimate questions about whether or not the vice presidential nominee is ready from day one to take over if something happens. And so the concern with Sarah Palin's disastrous rollout in 2008 was that she wasn't ready should John McCain not actually be able to perform his duty. But it speaks to this larger question of judgment. And so if John McCain were to choose her, then that would suggest that he might have poor judgment on other issues. And so ultimately, that's what matters. And that's where the vice presidential nominee actually matters, because he or she is a reflection on their running mates, just general sort of judgment and good sense. I think that still kind of matters this year in that respect. I think that, Senator Harris, I think, has proven her mettle. She hasn't had, a Katie Couric interview or a Charles Gibson interview where she said something inane that could end up on Saturday Night Live in a pejorative kind of way. So I think she has met could she take over if something were to happen to Joe Biden issue. I think, her position as being a woman of color is somewhat different for the race for a couple of reasons. One, we are going to await the data to see whether or not it has a mobilizing effect in Asian American communities. And then I think there was the potential that had a woman who wasn't African American been chosen to be the vice presidential running mate, whether or not that would have had a demobilizing effect in African American communities. Not that it would have affected African Americans' general proclivity to vote for Democratic candidates, but whether or not there would have been people who were upset who would have needed additional resources and additional cultivation in order to get them to turn out to vote, because Joe Biden had basically promised a Black woman on the ticket. And so he would have made an unforced error by reneging on the promise of a woman, but then the implication that he was going to pick a woman of color, because he was sending very strong signals there. I think the difference with Mike Pence was Mike Pence had to hit that hurdle in 2016 when he was first chosen. I think people understand sort of who he is and how closely tied to the Trump administration he is. And so I don't know if there was any lack of confidence about him being able to step into the role should President Trump be incapacitated. But I think sort of the bigger question is he going to represent a marked departure from the behavior of the Trump administration? And he is, proven to be a loyal sort of soldier and would, likely signal that he would do the same things as Trump would do.
Yeah, I certainly agree with all of that. I think that Pence was originally chosen, I think, in part to try to reassure the Republican Party establishment that Trump, who was someone who had no previous political experience, never run for office, never held any public office, was would be reliable and would govern in their interests. The other thing about Mike Pence is I think he did help to cement the tie between Donald Trump and the white evangelical community. Donald Pence is someone who has had a very close relationship with the evangelicals, is very, very conservative on the issues that they care about in particular. And so at least in 2016, before Trump himself had much of a record, I think that was something that he helped him do. And indeed, Trump won over 80% of the white evangelical vote in 2016, which was actually even slightly more than either Mitt Romney or George W. Bush had won. In 2020, I'm not sure that Pence really adds anything or subtracts anything from Trump. I think people now know exactly what Trump stands for. They know what he's done. And his vice presidential running mate at this point is probably not much of a factor. Certainly, there's always a concern about health, about age, and in the aftermath of his COVID diagnosis, that became an even bigger concern. But I don't think anyone believes that Mike Pence would govern much differently from Donald Trump if he were to take over, especially in the last few weeks or months of Trump's presidency. With Kamala Harris, I agree with Andra that it was sent an important signal, I think, to two important voting groups, African American voters and women. So, of course, Biden had already promised to choose a woman as his running mate, but by choosing an African American woman, a woman of color, and also the first person of South Asian descent as well, I think that he has helped to cement his ties to those groups, and those are groups that are going to be critical to his success, to his chances of winning this election. The age issue is certainly there for Biden, but again, I really don't think that in itself is going to have much of an impact on the way people vote and the outcome of the election. If Joe Biden becomes president, then I think there will be a lot of attention paid to the role of Kamala Harris in his administration, and to the possibility that somewhere along the way in the next 4 years that she could be required to take over. Certainly, there are questions already about whether President Biden would run for a second term in 2024, given the fact that he'd be well over 80 years of age, and for that reason alone, I think Kamala Harris is going to get a lot of attention if she becomes vice president, and because she will automatically become the front runner for the presidential nomination in 2024 if for any reason Biden does not run again.
Thank you. Well, I suppose like a follow-up question to that would be, if in the scenario that Biden actually wins the presidency, President Trump has made a lot of comments about not wanting to commit to a peaceful transition of power. What do you suspect might happen, especially as this is something quite unprecedented, no pun intended. But yeah.
Well, I'm going to be hopeful, and I'm going to look at signals from other players who are involved in it. So in particular, I think Senate leadership, for instance, like Mitch McConnell, for instance, I think would probably have a sit down with President Trump and tell him that he has to do this for the peaceful transition of power. And I would hope that President Trump would actually heed those calls, that he wouldn't get the support from Congress that he thinks he would get in doing this. I think, the other issue would be I just hear anecdotally from folks who are connected to the military that, like, he wouldn't get the support that one would need to have the type of military junta, for instance, in order to make something like that happen. So, I think the bigger question isn't going to be, on January 20th, him sitting in the Oval Office and refusing to leave. I think the bigger question is how litigious he's going to be. And I think the probability of his litigiousness is going to be correlated with the closeness of the vote. And so I think he's gearing up for something like a Bush v. Gore to validate him. I don't necessarily think he's, planning on getting on TV yet. I hope that this doesn't happen, and saying I'm not going anywhere and I dare you to make me go. And so we're just going to pray that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I think the danger is more in a contested election if it turns out that the election is close and the outcome actually hinges on one or two states where the vote margins are very narrow, and where, for example, there may be a delayed counting of ballots where there may be questions about which ballots should be counted and which ballots should not be counted, particularly among absentee votes that are coming in late. That's where I think we really could see something. Both campaigns are gearing up for that. We know that both certainly the Trump campaign, but also the Biden campaign are prepared. They have teams of election lawyers ready to go in case this does come down to one or two states. My hunch is that that's not going to be the case. I think it's more likely that we'll have a pretty decisive outcome, and that it'll become clear relatively quickly what the outcome is going to be. We may not know by election night as we normally do, but I think within 24 to 48 hours, we'll have a very good idea of the results in a lot of the key swing states. We'll probably know some of them on election night, actually. I think there's a good chance, for example, that we'll know where Florida is unless it's extremely close. Florida counts its absentee ballots very, very quickly. So I think we'll know some results on election night, probably enough to get an idea of the direction things are going in. And within 24 to 48 hours, we'll probably have a pretty good idea of the outcome. And it probably won't be so close or depend so much on the outcome in any one swing state that there will really be a strong incentive for either side to go to court to contest the outcome. That said, we can't say for sure that won't happen. I never would have predicted what happened in 2000, where the election wasn't decided until weeks later by the Supreme Court. And with Donald Trump, you can never be sure what he's going to do. I think a lot of his threats are really, it's just part of his showmanship. This is the way he appeals to his base. It's the kind of rhetoric he feels, stirs up his base and gets them worked up enough that they'll get out and vote for him. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't take it seriously. I think it's very dangerous. I think there are individuals out there in the country who could potentially engage in acts of violence. I think they'd probably be isolated, but I don't think we can rule that out entirely if Trump claims that the election's been stolen from him, that we couldn't potentially see acts of violence. So let's just all hope that does not happen.
Thank you so much. Kind of like as we are approaching the election, one of the things that I was wondering a little bit more about was what particular role do you think the debates have played in this particular election, and what type of precedent does that set for future elections? In the first presidential debate, we saw that there was a lot of talking over one another and some outright name calling. The vice presidential debates were really just like a demonstration of how much exercising caution people have to use when speaking and making sure that people have the chance to talk to one another. And then we saw the dueling town halls last week. And so I was kind of wondering what you thought this would kind of do for future elections and where that might take us.
So in general, for people who have studied elections or election debates are important because they convey information to people who don't have a lot of information about elections. And so part of the shame of the first election was you didn't actually learn a whole lot. And so if there were people who were turning in to learn things about the candidates and about the issues, they really didn't get to learn much of anything because of all of the shouting. What was somewhat different about this election cycle relative to others was that many people, according to public opinion surveys, went into the debates already with their minds made up. So they didn't actually really expect to be swayed one way or the other by what they heard, because I think most people have kind of made up their minds already. So in that respect, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing that people didn't learn as much as they could have. This probably reinforced what people thought. So if you hated Donald Trump, you were horrified by his behavior. And if you loved Donald Trump, then you probably thought that he was sticking it to the man and was again speaking truth to power and to the elites. At the end of the day, I think we all lose. And one of the things that's actually, interesting about this cycle, but it was also true last cycle, is the debate where people tend to learn the most is the foreign policy focused debate, because that's usually where Americans just don't have a whole lot of knowledge. And we're not having that debate this time around. The Trump campaign wanted to make this debate kind of foreign policy focused, but the Commission on Debate says, no, we're going to try to do a redo of the first debate. I think the bigger question is, are enough people going to pay attention to this debate where if they don't know anything yet, they're actually going to learn something? Because I think people might have been so appalled and turned off by the first debate that they may not turn in for the spectacle just because they just don't want to see a repeat of what they saw before.
Yeah, I think that's right. What we know from some of the polling data is that the percentage of voters who plan to watch the final debate is considerably smaller than the percentage who watch the first debate. It's usually the case that the first debate attracts the largest audience anyway. So we wouldn't expect as big an audience for the third debate, or now second debate. And I don't think it'll get as large an audience. Not only do relatively few people still remain undecided or persuadable, but actually by the time we get to the last debate this coming Thursday, it's possible that close to half of voters will have already cast their ballots. We're approaching that. We're approaching 30% now, so we could be getting somewhere in the 40 to 50% range by Thursday. Obviously, if people have already voted, then there's no point trying to persuade them. So I wouldn't expect it to have much of an effect. It'll be interesting to see whether the change in rules, which allows where the candidates will be muted when the other candidate is giving his 2-minute initial response to the question from the moderator, whether that makes a difference in the behavior of the voters, and especially the behavior of President Trump, or whether because we know he's unhappy about that. He's complained quite a bit about that. He sees that as somehow that the debate commission is siding with Biden, is trying to help Biden, which is not true. But it will be sort of interesting to see how he handles that, and whether we see a repeat performance, despite the change in the rules.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I suppose as we're wrapping up, I have a couple of last questions. One of them is, what do you think the role of polarization might be in this election? And secondly, what specifically do you have in terms of closing comments or what you're looking for in this election?
Well, I don't think there's much question that the American electorate is extremely polarized right now. The divide between supporters of the two parties, both in terms of where they stand on a wide range of issues, but also how they view the candidates and how they view the opposing side, is greater than I think at any time in the past. President Trump is, I think without much question, the most polarizing president that we've seen in the modern era of presidential politics. And that's saying something, because we've been seeing a rise in polarization over the last 30 or 40 years. But we see, for example, the biggest divide in presidential approval between Democrats and Republicans that we've ever seen with President Trump in the entire era of public opinion polling. where close to 90% of Republicans approve of the job President Trump is doing, and less than 10% of Democrats approve of the job that he's doing. That's very different from what we saw. If you went back 30 or 40 years and looked at earlier presidents like Eisenhower and Kennedy and even Nixon. So that deep divide means that people are pretty much locked into their choices, and there are relatively few undecided or persuadable voters, and that's why we've seen that. I think in the polling on this election, the preferences for the two candidates have been very stable. Biden's been leading in the national polls, by margins ranging from 5 to 10 points for most of the last 6 months. It's gone up a little bit in the last few weeks, where it's now closer to 10 points. It was closer to 6 or 7 earlier, but that's not much of a change. And that may narrow again as we get closer to election day. But that's why I'd be very surprised to see Donald Trump actually win the popular vote. I mean, he's been trailing in the national polls consistently and by a pretty good margin for months and months. The only real suspense right now is going to be whether that popular vote margin that we expect Biden to get on when all the votes are counted will translate into 270 plus votes in the Electoral College. If the popular vote margin, this is what I'll be watching for, if the popular vote margin gets much over 4 or 5 points, then the probability that we could see another so-called misfire, where the popular vote winner actually loses in the Electoral College, becomes less and less. Beyond 5 or 6 points, it's very unlikely that will happen. So I think that's where we are right now. But no one after 2016 is going to say absolutely for certain there's no way that Trump could pull it off.
I think sort of related to that, and Dr. Abramowitz is the polarization expert, so, I follow his lead on that, but, I completely agree. I think people are pretty hardwired into their preferences. So what's important about this election is turnout. So we know that there's going to be record-breaking turnout this year. I think it's just a question of who maximizes the turnout of their base. And so we know Trump's base is smaller, but because of the geographic distribution of that base, he's hoping that is still going to propel him to 170 electoral college votes because of institutional stuff like small state biases that actually amplify their votes relative to larger states. So I'm definitely going to be paying attention to that. The other thing that I think we're going to be paying attention to is how different groups are voting in different states. So, there's a lot of attention this year with this large, popular vote lead. And we're seeing statewide polls that suggest that Biden is more competitive in states where historically he shouldn't have been, like Georgia and Texas. Right. So what this is going to come down to is turnout of minority groups, and in particular, how the vote splits. So I'm going to be really curious to see sort of what the vote is overall amongst Latinx voters, particularly in a state like Texas. And so, I think many people assume that all voters of color vote like African Americans. That's not true. And so I think the big question this time around is does the Latinx vote sort of break for Biden in the neighborhood of 65% or 70%? So the lower that vote is, the more likely it is that Trump could hold on to a state like Texas or hold on to a state like Florida. And similarly, if those numbers get higher, that could actually even help Texas turn blue this election cycle, or even turn a state like Georgia blue, where part of the increase in minority voters really isn't about African Americans. It's more about Asian American and Latinx voters.
Yeah, I'd say one other thing that I want to urge people to watch closely in this election, if they're not already doing so, are the Senate elections. Because regardless of who wins the White House, but especially if Biden does win the White House, his ability to actually have his agenda enacted and carry out the policies that he's promising depends very much on having a Democratic majority in both the House and Senate. The House is almost certain to remain in Democratic hands, but there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the Senate. And I think that one trend that we've seen in recent years, partly as a result of polarization, is the growing nationalization of House and Senate elections. The outcomes of these House and Senate races depends to a much greater extent now than in the past on what happens in the presidential election. So as the presidential election goes in a state, the chances are that's the way the Senate election is going to go. That's what I'll be watching in Georgia. If Joe Biden carries Georgia, there's a new poll today put out by the New York Times, Siena Polling, tied. Georgia is tied in both the presidential and Senate race. So I'll be watching that very closely.
Well, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I think we probably could go for another hour, but I know everyone's time is really, really busy right now through this window. Let me just say thank you, Professor Abramowitz, Professor Gillespie, Shreya, for doing a wonderful job navigating through this and moderating. I think as Pi Sigma Alpha members across the country are rallied to get out to vote, I think it's clear that some of the sort of the elements we've talked about today will be on their minds even as we move through this election. And it all sets up perfectly for what our next Centennial Series talk is. So we may have a change in administrations, we may not. But next week, we're going to bring in an expert on finding a job on Capitol Hill. So next week, we have all sorts of folks who are interested in making a trip to DC and how they're going to get their first job on the Hill. With that, I'll let everyone go. Thank you so much for, again, being part of this event. This is part of our Pi Sigma Alpha Centennial Series. It's exciting to look backwards, but it's also exciting to think about what the next 100 years may be in politics. So again, good afternoon, and thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
Thank you.